Most of the content and interaction designers that you encounter in the content strategy field come from design, copywriting, journalism, and similar careers. In those fields, content presentation design happens in a GUI, a graphical user interface. In the new field of conversation design, the interactions happen in a vui, a voice user interface. Rebecca Evanhoe and Diana Deibel are experts in this new type of design. They've got some great insights into how you can create truly conversational voice interactions.
Welcome to the Content Strategy Insights podcast, where accomplished content strategy experts share their wisdom with our friends in the content community. We talk with professionals who work across the span of content strategy, from small businesses to big enterprises, from content design to content marketing, from solo consultancies to huge agencies. Our mission is to democratize content strategy, to make its principles and practices accessible to everyone. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 71 of the Content Strategy Insights podcast. I'm really delighted today to have with us Rebecca Evanhoe and Diana Deibel. Rebecca is a freelance conversation designer, and Diana is she's a design director at Grand Studio. And Rebecca and Diana, I want you to tell the folks a little bit more about yourselves. Oh, wait, one other thing I want to mention is that the reason you both came to my attention is that you're working on a book right now. It's called Conversations with Things, and it's coming out probably, about a year from now, I think you said. But I just want to note that that's something folks should keep an eye on, is to keep an eye peeled for your book. But, well, Rebecca, you're showing up first on my screen. Tell the folks a little bit more about your background and then how you got into conversation design.
Like many conversation designers, I have a bit of an unusual pathway into the work. My undergrad degree is in chemistry, and I have an MFA in fiction writing. So I'm a bit of a right brain, left brain person, like a lot of people in this field. I got my start working for a startup in Gainesville, Florida, when I was still in graduate school, and it was a conversation design role, but it was, very much DIY at a tiny little startup, and I didn't know I was doing conversation design. And from there, when the industry started growing and Alexa became a public figure, I realized I had this skill set that suddenly was in very high demand. And from there, I worked at a couple of different places, Mobiquity, and most recently, I was at AWS.
Nice. And Diana, tell us a little bit about your path.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Larry. Like Rebecca, I have a kind of circuitous path here and a bit accidental as well. My degree is in playwriting, which seemed like a long shot at the time, but now turned out to be really useful. And after I graduated, I did the thing of moving to New York City, which is what you do when you have any kind of theater interest and are able to, and just worked a bunch of odd jobs until I found myself working in theater and documentary production, which evolves itself into a lot of audio work, a lot of sound editing and clip editing. And when I moved to Chicago, continued that documentary work, but there's less entertainment industry in general in Chicago than there is on the coast. So eventually found my way into, similar to Rebecca, a smaller startup that was health-based, so a health tech company. And the role that I signed on for there originally was as a health writer, which was, again, like Rebecca, not at all what it sounds like or what the job entailed. But it was writing kind of interactive multimedia patient education that over the course of a couple of years evolved into vui products, where we were doing IVR outreach. Started out very small, like reminders and things like that, and evolved into longitudinal conversations to sort of triage patients on behalf of nurses. So it got pretty complicated towards the end.
Exactly. Hey, I want to stop you right there because you're starting to throw out 3-letter acronyms. So I want to slow down when I bring our folks up to speed. But I love, so vui, V-U-I, that's like voice user interface, sort of an analogy to GUI. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. And then IVR, you use that term. What is that?
Interactive voice response. It is essentially a robocall or one of those awesome phone banks that you call when you're calling like a flight airline or a bank, or God help you, your internet company.
I think we all know that horror. Yeah.
Mhm.
No, that's great. Well, and that's we were talking before we went on the air about how refreshing it is to me to have folks who come from entirely different backgrounds into this world, because almost everybody else coming to not everybody, but I mean, a lot of the people I've talked to in this podcast are coming from like the GUI, the graphical user interface, like how to display a story or a diagram or something on paper in words. So the VUI, how do you say that? VUI?
VUI like rhymes with gooey.
VUI rhymes with GUI. Okay, that makes perfect sense. So tell me, do either of you have any experience operating in a GUI? I mean, you do just browsing the web and stuff, but can you talk a little bit about the differences in designing for a VUI versus a GUI?
Yeah, sure. So I work, Grand Studio is a product design consultancy, and get asked to do a lot of weird things, but most of them result in at least some form of a digital product. Sometimes that encompasses other channels or service design as well. But the bread and butter is really around digital product design. So I actually kind of backed into that from VUI, which is not, I think, the traditional path, but I've found it to be there are a lot of corollaries in terms of process. So you still, like, if you're coming from a human-centered design base, it's the same approach either way. It's just a different output. There are, to me, a lot more affordances in screen design than there are in VUI design, simply because we've learned a lot longer how to interact, quote unquote, appropriately with a visual digital product, where we haven't had that kind of time frame to do that in a conversational product. And we expect a lot more as humans from something that claims to be conversational and have a conversation UI than we do from something. We're a lot more forgiving around screen design.
That's so interesting to me that, like, because conversation is probably the oldest form of human communication, and printed stuff or displayed stuff on a screen is much newer. So it's almost like you're tugged at both ends. It almost seems like that there's this obligation to be true to human nature, but you're kind of new at it, and you don't have all the experience, the history, and the legacy, and the tools that GUI designers have. How do you cope with that?
I think that question is still being answered. I think a lot of the big kind of pain points of designing for voice interfaces are navigation. People don't know, there's a lot of discussion about whether you should give your user a menu verbally, whether you should keep it open-ended, at what point you might introduce a menu. Users aren't sure. There's not a lot of standardization, so users aren't sure if they can say things like skip ahead or go back or start over. Sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. And it depends on the chatbot or the voice assistant that you're talking to. It's the example I like to use is like when you're searching a website and you don't see the information that you want right away. By now, we all know to start looking for those 3 little lines that they call the hamburger menu, mm-hmm. and kind of go from there. Or maybe you'll go back out to Google and try your search again and see if you can hit a more specific page. So when we're doing that with GUI, we know alternate ways to try and find the information we need if it's not working the first time. With voice, there's no standardization. So we don't know, we don't know how to find that information. And there's the added pain point of people get much more frustrated more easily with voice interfaces. The frustration mounts really quickly, and so there's a lot at stake for conversation designers to work around.
No, I can picture that, because the expectation is like, hey, I'm just having a conversation. Why can't you just answer my darn question?
Exactly.
Yeah, right. So there aren't conventions. There's no well, kind of related to that, I think, is like, neither of you have mentioned explicitly the practice of UX design, but would you both identify as UX designers in the interaction design part of that field? Is that?
I would say a firm yes for me.
And Diana?
Yeah, I think so. It's so funny because everybody kind of defines UX designer a different way. So short answer, yes. Longer answer, maybe. I think it depends on the definition that's coming out of that.
Yeah, no, because you both obviously are designing conversational experiences, and anyhow, that's, and I think one of the common themes across content strategy is that labels and terminology are completely inconsistent, and you're just doing the work, and like people will call you whatever they want on, so you have something to put on your LinkedIn profile. One thing I love about just reading the table of contents for your book at the Rosenfeld Media site, you talk about it's very principles based, that you start right off the bat with the principles. Can one or both of you talk about the principles that underlie conversation design? Because I'm kind of inferring from some of the things you said the need for a principle based approach, but I'm just wondering what those principles are and how they manifest in your work.
Yeah.
Rebecca, you want to take that one?
Sure. So one thing that we're finding as we gather our thoughts for this book and do the research for this book is that I think particularly because this field is so interdisciplinary, there are linguists, there are playwrights, fiction writers like me, there are people with data backgrounds, there's developers, everybody has kind of different ideas about what these principles are. So I like to start by saying that there are some unique artifacts that conversation designers develop as part of what we do. One of them is persona, and that is distinct from user persona. UX people talk about user personas. When conversation designers use it, they're talking about the personality or character of the system or the chatbot or the virtual assistant. So there's the persona component. We do a lot of work with actually writing the prompts, like writing what a conversational interface responds with. We do a lot of work, or at least are involved with training data and how that impacts the user's experience. And we also, kind of the bulk of our work is looking holistically at all the different conversational pathways that a user could take. And that includes both quote unquote happy paths, of which there are often many, and error paths, and how to repair, how to recover from that. So those are the key components, I think, that are unique to conversation design. The processes that we use are more general, sort of UX, starting with user research, iterating on prototypes, doing lots of usability testing. So there's kind of a snapshot of some of the work of conversation design and as a foundation. And Diana, do you want to talk about some of the principles in our book? I know we talk a lot about trust, things like that.
Yeah, there is. I mean, that is probably the biggest one. Is I think anytime you're going to use an AI to do anything, it has to be there has to be trust that the AI is going to serve up whatever it is that you're asking of it, whether that's served up in a conversation or that's served up on a screen or in any other capacity. But beyond that, there also has to be a very distinct line in the sand of what is the responsibility of the AI and what is the responsibility of the human. And that extends beyond, as let's say conversational partners, so people sort of on opposing sides of that conversation. It also pertains to the people that are essentially on the same side as the AI that are helping provide that service. Like if you think of a chatbot, and you might be talking to the chatbot and it's powered by an AI that you're talking to, and it's a machine, it's a system. And then at some point you may get switched over to a human who in that same channel, in that same modality is conversing with you in this, very similar way, but you have to have those lines in the sand of, from a system perspective, when does the system stop and the human take over? And then a very clear external facing perspective of as the user of this product, when am I talking to a bot? When am I talking to a human?
Are there conventions around that? Like, I'm trying to think of examples where it's like, hey, now you're talking to a human. Is there anything like that that's...
I mean, very clearly, I've done this before. I've had very jarring experience with this before. Let's go back to the IVR, the phone bank. If you call in to, let's say, change a flight, right? Like, you probably get hit with that. Press 1 for this, press 2 for that. System first, and then eventually it will say, like, okay, I'm going to transfer you now to someone who can help you. And then you have somebody, hi, this is so and so, and I can help you. I see that you've been giving us some information. Like, there's some sort of transition that indicates when you are going to leave the bot portion of the interaction and when you've fully passed into the human portion. That's a very like basic version of that. But there should always be some kind of like flag wave of, we're done here, and hello, welcome to this side of things.
Right. It just seems like that would be a really important cue for humans to like know what's going, like, so they don't feel like they're constantly in a Turing test or something.
Absolutely. And there are groups that are publishing ethical standards, like a snapshot of where that, Microsoft published ethical guidelines. And there's a bunch of other groups like AI Now Institute, for example, who are looking at these sorts of things. And all of them are saying a bot should never pretend like it's a human. It should always be explicit about being an artificial mind. And I think Google Duplex kind of blurred those lines in a way that, and that was the technology that like would sort of call and schedule hair appointments or restaurant reservations as a synthetic voice, as an artificial intelligence. But it was so convincing that the people answering the phone didn't know that it was not a real person.
And that was interesting because the prompts that made you think it was human, it was like introducing just sort of ers and ums and things that human beings would do. And so tell me, that's an interesting one, because it seems like if you were just this, making this up out of thin air, you'd think, oh, that'll make people comfortable. But it turns out that it doesn't. It sounds like.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think, our cell phones know more about us than the current iteration of in-home virtual assistants do. But there is something about how intimately the human brain interacts with language and with communication, that people are much more creeped out by things that they're talking to, right? They feel more uncanny. A lot of people say, I've heard people say over and over, I don't want an Alexa because she's always listening, which, technically isn't true. But there is something a lot more gut level with conversational interfaces that makes people extra easily spooked, I think.
Yep. What you just said reminds me of the trust issue, that like we trust Alexa to just be listening for the prompt to start. And that just seems like, what's the mechanism by which you instill that trust? Like,
well, I mean, that's why Alexa has things like, I mean, if we're specifically talking about Alexa here, obviously all of the devices have some sort of indicator, but Alexa specifically has that blue ring to sort of give you an indicator beyond just like an oral ding, or I can't make the sound, it's not a ding, but that gives you that, so that you have kind of different ways of perceiving that it's listening. That said, you might not always be aware when that comes on. So you may miss the oral cue, your back may be turned to it. You might not, it might be positioned in another room or something. So there are, I think, to be the counterpoint to Rebecca's, like, it's not that bad, it's not listening. I'm definitely more of a tinfoil hat. Like, we leave ours unplugged all the time. My husband won't even allow the Google Hub in the house. It's my office. So we're on the further spectrum of that. But I think there is some legitimate concern particularly from people that have experienced negative influence of surveillance, that this is going to extend beyond what they're comfortable with sharing privately. And because of that idea that it has to listen, it has to send things up to the cloud, even if it's indicating that it's listening. We've all seen the horror stories and heard the horror stories of moments where something has gone wrong and a device has listened when it shouldn't have been listening, or sent it somewhere when it shouldn't have been sending it. So I think there's kind of a fair skepticism of an ability of a device to protect a user's privacy.
Right. And that gets in, I think I can almost picture a whole other conversation about the ethics of this. I think back to that, what was the Microsoft thing that learned within like 12 hours how to be just a racist troll?
Yeah.
That was, yeah. And were there lessons from that inform these sort of ethical?
Well, I would say if you haven't read Weapons of Math Destruction, put that on your reading list right away.
I'll put it in
Kathy
the show
O'Neill.
notes too, yeah.
It's all about essentially like how we teach AI via algorithms, and whatever we're feeding it has a bias. And if we are trying to do our best to like go beyond that bias or our own bias, we always have one, and we're always going to, the machine can only be as good as the people that design it and the information that it's fed.
Absolutely.
So, Rebecca, do you have a?
Yeah, the book I'll plug for is Algorithms of Oppression, which I talk about almost every day. But yeah, I mean, I think there's the human bias that comes in, but there's also just the simple fact, and Diana said this too, the data itself is not always reliable, and the data is not always as robust as it needs to be. So an example of what that looks like in conversation design is these assistants tend to work better for white people. They tend to work better for males. They tend to work better for people like me from the Midwest. I'm from Kansas. I don't have a Northeastern accent. I don't have, I don't have any sort of that quote unquote neutral accent, although neutral accent isn't actually a thing. So there's certain populations that these work better for. And it's because the training data is not representing enough people. Another great example is that there's a group, folks with people who have Down syndrome, a lot of them could really benefit from voice assistance because it can help them with daily tasks and practicing things and all kinds of stuff. But because of different like physical differences in their mouths, their sound waves are different. And these devices haven't been trained on those types of sound waves. And so, Diana, what's the name of that? Is it Project Listen? There's a group that is working, the Canadian Down Syndrome Society is working with Google to sort of correct this. That's just one example of a type of bias where like the training data wasn't robust. It didn't include all people.
Interesting. So the issues of like inclusion are super important here. If you're going to have a conversation with somebody, you better understand like how their vocal cords work and how they might be limited. And yeah, that's so interesting. And you guys are all you're figuring that out as you go. It sounds like.
A lot of the research is unfolding in real time. Each week, some big study comes out, and we're like, oh, we have to put this in the book. And our understanding is certainly evolving, and the whole field is changing, on a weekly basis, which is really exciting.
Yeah, it sounds like an interesting field. Hey, one thing I want to make sure we get to, and I don't know how to exactly stitch it in with what we've talked about, but basically, like everybody else in the content world, we're all thinking about some kind of a content management system where the content that we design and create and manage, it gets tucked away, and a lot of what you've talked about like there's these answers that are served up, or where is that is there a content management system for voice content, or how does the sort of back end of this work?
The $1 million question. Most conversation designers that I talk to, and my own experience sort of stitches together a bunch of different tools, and it's a common complaint that that sort of one-stop shop where you're storing all of your assets, the training data, the prompts the bot's reading. There's videos, there's visual data too that comes along in these interactions. A lot of times those things are all stored in different places and are hard to keep in sync. Diana, I know you had experience with this as well.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, like to the broader question, Larry, like there are banks of training data for voice for NLU systems that have come from kind of from the IVR legacy of just like collecting phone calls and people talking, which is why we have such a narrow focus on what voices are accepted by machines or not accepted by machines. And then beyond that, there's been this work, especially by some of the bigger companies like Google, like Amazon, to create repositories of different voices or different inputs, if it's like in chat, which Project Understood, that's the Down syndrome project.
I'll get that.
So it can depend on what you are using. Like if you're using one of these platforms that already exist, these repositories that already exist in terms of the content management and how that gets what you have to pull from in terms of recognition, and then and what you might have to train. And then in terms of like how it gets connected, you have to do the work of kind of tagging it and saying this phrase belongs to this question, or what we call an intent. Like I intend to ask you about delivery times for my pizza, and therefore anything that I say that's tagged with delivery times for my pizzas, I might say this a number of different ways, or there might be like a number of subtopics beneath that. But as a designer, we have to tag all that to make sure that it gets kind of bucketed in the right place, so that the system doesn't answer you about, pizza toppings, if that's not what you actually mean for it to be answering.
No, that's so it's a little mind blowing to think about all the possible questions, all the possible answers, and then the metadata to structure the data so that you can get back to it, and then have that happen in real time. I'm impressed you. Just impressed beyond belief that this whole thing even works. It's pretty amazing. Hey, I noticed we're already coming close to time. These things always go so quickly. One thing I like to do in the podcast is always give my guests a chance. If there's anything that's come up in the conversation that you want to comment on, or just anything that's on your mind about conversation design or UX design or design in general, before we wrap up, either or both of you have anything you want to make sure we get to?
I always like to bring up in this field, I think this field is such a perfect example of where the tech industry needs people who've studied the humanities. I always make a plug for that. So many different disciplines have been studying how people interact with each other, how people talk to each other, how people emote together, and these, this is linguistics, this is fiction writing and playwriting and poetry. People with humanities perspectives are really valuable in this space. And I think that tech companies are starting to recognize that and appreciate how that has a place. And that's always exciting to me. And I also like to use that as like a call to invite people. Maybe you have a writing background or you have a philosophy background. If this work interests you, you can probably find a way into it.
Great.
Yeah, and I would build. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I love that because I have half my friends are humanities majors, so there's work for them in this field. Great.
Yeah, we're employable again.
Exactly. Yeah.
To build on that, I would also say, in general, in the design industry, I don't think this is surprising news to anyone. We have a real diversity problem. We just don't have enough different perspectives and voices involved, and particularly when you are building something from the ground up, like we are with GUI design. Of course, it has been around since essentially the 50s, and there is a history here. But this latest push of using natural conversation and finding new ways to use the technology and pushing beyond what we've had really requires a more inclusive outlook. And we simply cannot design with the people that have been designing. And that's not to say that people don't have experience or value to provide to the field if they've been working in it, but we need new people, we need new perspectives, and we need more diversity, quite frankly.
Yeah, I think the tech field in general certainly has issues with that, and I've heard it. I also do a lot of community organizing work in like open source software and things like that. And in a thing that comes up in all those places over and over again is like not only this idea of inclusion, like not only just accounting for a variety of diversity in your customers, but diversity within your team and in your the folks actually doing the work. Like one way I heard this put was like, not that we built this for you, we built this with you.
Absolutely.
Yeah, co-creation's huge, but yeah, you're never going to reach all your customers if you don't have representation of your customers within your team.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not going to happen.
Do you know like ways of like, if either or both of you have ideas about like both on the hiring side, like how people can become more, cast a wider net and be more inclusive in their recruiting, but also for people who are in underrepresented groups who want to break into this. Any thoughts on that from either of you?
I have strong opinions that it's like, to be frank, there are Black experts in user experience design and conversation design. There are, Native American people who are experts in this field, and people just aren't doing the work to find them. We all just need to try harder. And I say we, I'm a white person. We just need to put more time into it. It's sort of astounding to me. I think the question is asked a lot, like, what can people do to hire more inclusively? And it's keep looking until you have a diverse set of highly qualified candidates, and you'll find them.
I would also say I'm not a D&I expert by any means. I too am a white Latina, so I get that privilege as well. I would say that what I have learned by talking to just a few D&I experts is if you're concerned about hiring, look at your pipeline, look at your process, and see what you are doing. There are probably a lot of things you're doing to exclude a lot of different kinds of people, not necessarily about race, that if you are able to like sit down with somebody who is an expert in diversity and inclusion and go through what you're doing, you'll be able to kind of pinpoint where those pinches in the pipe are, and you can open that up a little bit more to everyone.
Right.
And one thing I also like to say, it's not enough to bring in Black people, people of color into these companies, into these workspaces, if they are unsafe in those spaces. If the culture is oppressive, if the culture is racist, you're not going to retain people. And, I think hiring is one piece of the puzzle, and then culturally making workspaces that are safe for everyone and where everyone can flourish, that's another big piece that companies need to be working on.
Yeah, I think we're all, I'm settled in for the long haul on that, on advancing that. And I think it's not an episodic thing like, oh, great, we recruited some people or we changed this one thing. It's like, no, you really, and what you just said to culture, there's some fundamental cultural change that needs to happen with this. Wait, one last thing. Where can folks reach you if they want to follow you? Are there places you're active on social media, or what's the best way for people to keep in touch with you?
For me, Rebecca Evanhoe, you can follow me on Twitter. My handle is Revanhoe, the letter R, and then my last name.
And Diana.
And Twitter is good for me too. I'm Diana. I'm at Diana Does This on Twitter.
Well, thanks so much to both of you. I really enjoyed the conversation. I feel like we could talk forever, but I'd like to give my folks, I figure most people are pulling in the driveway, they finished their commute, so.
Sounds good. Thanks for having us. This has been really fun, and we appreciate your questions very much.
Yeah, thank you, Larry.
Thank you for listening. If you can think of a friend who might enjoy this episode, please share it with them. And please join us again for our next content strategy interview.